When I first drove through the tree-lined streets of Maple Ridge, I knew I had found my forever home. The cul-de-sac nestled at the end of Oakwood Drive was everything I had dreamed of: peaceful, green, and far enough from the city to see stars at night. The colonial-style house with blue shutters charmed me instantly, but it was the backyard that sealed the deal. I stood in silent awe during the property viewing, surrounded by towering oaks and mature pines that must have witnessed decades of neighborhood history. Their sprawling canopies created a natural cathedral of dappled sunlight and cool shade. "These trees are at least 70 years old," the real estate agent explained, her voice hushed as if we were in a sacred space. "They provide complete privacy from neighboring properties and natural cooling in summer." I signed the papers that afternoon. After years of apartment living, the thought of having my own piece of nature felt like winning the lottery. I moved in during early spring, when the trees were just beginning to bud with new life. The first week was blissful. I arranged my furniture, hung pictures, and spent evenings on the back porch listening to the wind through the leaves. The neighbors seemed friendly enough, bringing welcome baskets and offering assistance with local information. It was exactly the community feeling I had hoped for. That illusion shattered on day 10, when I was planting flowers along my front walkway. A shadow fell across my work, and I looked up to see a woman in her 50s, immaculately dressed in pressed khakis and a polo shirt emblazoned with Maple Ridge HOA. "You must be the new homeowner," she said, not offering to help as I struggled to stand. "I am Karen Halstead, president of the Homeowners Association." I wiped my dirty hands on my jeans and extended one in greeting. "Nice to meet you. I am loving it here so far." Karen did not take my hand. Instead, she glanced past me toward my backyard. "I notice you have not done anything about the jungle situation back there. We do have standards in Maple Ridge." I followed her gaze, confused. The trees, they were one of the main reasons I bought the house. "Yes, well," she handed me a thick binder. "Here is the complete HOA guidelines. You will want to familiarize yourself with our aesthetic requirements. First impressions are everything for property values." She departed with a tight smile that never reached her eyes. I stood there, holding the unexpected weight of the binder, feeling as if I had just received a warning rather than a welcome. Later that evening, my next-door neighbor Tom stopped by while I was watering my new flowers. "I see you met the Queen of Maple Ridge," he said with a knowing look. "Is she always so intense?" I asked. Tom leaned closer. "Karen has been HOA president for 8 years running. Nobody challenges her anymore. She is obsessed with what she calls community aesthetics. But really, she just likes controlling people." "What about the trees?" I asked. She seemed bothered by them. "She has been on a mission to open up the skyline of Maple Ridge for years," Tom explained. "Karen believes tall trees make the neighborhood look unkempt and reduce property values. Several homeowners have already cut down their old trees after her pressure campaigns." I thanked Tom for the warning but dismissed it as neighborhood politics. After all, I had read through the HOA guidelines that evening. There were rules about house paint colors, lawn maintenance, and even approved mailbox styles, but nothing specific about tree height or density. In the following weeks, Karen's presence became a constant in my life. She left notes about my non-regulation mailbox color. She stopped by to point out unapproved patio chairs visible from the street. She even left a violation warning about the garden gnome my niece had given me as a housewarming gift. I addressed the smaller issues to keep the peace, but I noticed how Karen's gaze always drifted to my backyard trees during our interactions. "Those trees block everyone's view," she mentioned once, seemingly casual. Some neighbors have complained about how dark and overgrown it looks. I nodded politely but changed the subject. Those trees were not just landscaping to me. They were sanctuary. They were home. And little did I know they would soon become the battleground for a neighborhood war I never asked for. The first official complaint arrived 3 weeks after I moved in. A white envelope bearing the Maple Ridge HOA logo appeared in my mailbox. Inside was a notice printed on heavy cardstock. Attention! Unauthorized tree overgrowth on property requires immediate attention. Please trim all trees to regulation height within 14 days. I read the notice twice, then pulled out the massive HOA guidebook Corinne had given me. I spent that entire evening combing through every page, searching for specific regulations about trees. There were detailed rules about flower bed borders, acceptable lawn ornaments, and even approved brands of mailboxes, but nothing, absolutely nothing about tree height or density requirements. The next day, I called the HOA office directly. I received a notice about my trees, I explained to the secretary, but I cannot find any regulations about tree height in the guidelines. Oh, she hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. Those notices usually come directly from Corinne. Let me transfer you. Corinne answered with the efficiency of someone who had been expecting my call. Yes, the tree situation, she said without preamble. It is not explicitly in the written guidelines, but the board has interpretive authority on aesthetic matters. Several neighbors have expressed discomfort with how dark and overgrown your backyard appears. Which neighbors exactly? I asked. I am not at liberty to say, Corinne replied. Complaints are confidential, but I assure you the concern is widespread. I stood my ground. The trees are well maintained, healthy, and completely within my property line. Unless you can point to a specific rule they violate, I do not see a reason to remove them. Corinne's voice chilled. I strongly suggest you reconsider your position. The HOA board takes these matters very seriously. The warnings escalated over the next month. More formal notices appeared, each with increasingly urgent language. Final warning and compliance required became regular phrases in my mail. I began documenting everything, taking photos of each notice, recording dates, and keeping detailed notes of every interaction. One evening, Tom from next door knocked on my door. Just wanted to give you a heads up, he said, looking uncomfortable. Corinne is circulating a petition for a new bylaw about tree heights in the neighborhood. She is telling everyone your trees are a safety hazard during storms and harbor rodents and insects. That is ridiculous, I said. Those trees are healthier than most of the neighborhood lawns. I know, Tom agreed. I refused to sign, so did a few others, but Corinne has a way of wearing people down. The next morning, I received an email from the HOA board requesting my presence at their monthly meeting to discuss ongoing property compliance issues. I prepared a simple presentation with photos of my trees, arborist reports confirming their health, and highlighted sections of the HOA guidelines showing no violations had occurred. At the meeting, I presented my case calmly and factually. Several board members seemed receptive, nodding as I explained that the trees were a primary reason I purchased the property. But Corinne interrupted repeatedly. While the current guidelines may not explicitly address tree height, she argued, the HOA charter gives us authority to maintain community standards. These trees create an eyesore and potential hazard. They block mountain views for homes behind yours and reduce neighboring property values. When the vote came, it was 5-2 in Corinne's favor. The board would draft new tree height guidelines to be ratified at the next meeting. I left feeling defeated but not broken. The new guidelines would take at least a month to implement. I had time to research my options. But Karen was not waiting for official channels. The very next morning, I stepped into my backyard and froze. A bright red spray-painted X marked my largest oak tree. Similar marks decorated two other trees near the property line. My hands shook as I took photographs from every angle. Someone had trespassed onto my property during the night. This was no longer a bureaucratic dispute over rules and regulations. This was invasion. This was threat. I immediately reported the vandalism to both the local police and the HOA board. The police officer who responded took photographs but classified it as a minor property dispute. HOA issues are civil matters, he explained apologetically. Unless there is significant property damage, there is not much we can do. The HOA response was even less helpful. We have no knowledge of any marking of trees on your property, the email stated. The board does not condone trespassing or vandalism of any kind. That night I installed security cameras covering my backyard. Something told me this battle was just beginning. The red marks seemed to glow in the darkness outside my window, not just paint, but a declaration of war. Karen had escalated beyond paperwork and meetings, and so would I. Wednesday afternoon. I remember every detail with painful clarity. The weather was unseasonably warm for early autumn, with a cloudless sky that seemed to mock what was about to happen. I had been at work since early morning, my mind occupied with project deadlines rather than neighborhood disputes. At 2:17 p.m., my phone buzzed with a security camera alert. The notification showed figures moving in my backyard. My first thought was that Karen might be trespassing again to add more spray paint or leave another notice. I immediately left the office and raced home, calling the police as I drove. The sound hit me first, the mechanical roar of chainsaws, the splintering crack of wood giving way after decades of standing strong. I abandoned my car halfway up the driveway and ran toward the noise, my heart pounding in my ears. What I saw will haunt me forever. 3 men in work uniforms stood in my backyard, surrounded by destruction. My majestic oak trees, the sentinels that had stood guard over the property for generations, were on the ground. Their massive trunks lay like fallen giants, branches crushed beneath their weight. The stumps still smoked from the heat of chainsaw blades. The air smelled of gasoline and raw wood. "What are you doing?" I screamed, my voice breaking. Stop right now." The workers looked up, startled by my appearance. One man shut off his chainsaw while another consulted a clipboard. "We have authorization right here, ma'am," he said, extending the paperwork toward me. "Maple Ridge HOA tree removal, signed by the president, Karen Halstead." I snatched the paper from his hand. There it was, an official-looking work order on HOA letterhead with Karen's signature authorizing the removal of non-compliant vegetation. The date stamp was from yesterday. "This is illegal," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "You have no right to be on my property. I never authorized this. The HOA has no authority to remove my trees without my consent." The workers exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Look, we just follow the work orders," the foreman explained. "If there is a dispute, you need to take it up with whoever signed the authorization. We were told the homeowner had been properly notified." I called the police again, emphasizing that destruction of property was in progress. While waiting, I documented everything, taking videos and photos of the workers, their truck, the paperwork, and the devastation they had caused. I estimated the trees to be worth tens of thousands of dollars, not counting their environmental value and the privacy they had provided. When two police officers finally arrived, Corinne appeared as if summoned by magic, striding across my lawn with the confidence of someone who believed herself untouchable. "Officers, I am glad you are here," she announced. "This homeowner has been in violation of community standards despite multiple warnings. The HOA has legal authority to remedy violations at the homeowner's expense." I fought to maintain my composure as I showed the officers my documentation. The HOA guidelines with no mention of tree regulations, the records of my objections, the security footage of the marked trees, and now this unauthorized destruction of property. "This appears to be a civil matter between the homeowner and the HOA," one officer said after reviewing everything. "We cannot determine who has legal authority in this situation." "These were my trees on my property," I insisted. "How is their destruction not criminal?" "HOAs often have broad enforcement powers in their covenants," the officer explained. "The courts would need to determine if those powers were exceeded." As the police departed without taking action, Corinne approached me with a smile that made my blood boil. "You should thank me," she said, gesturing to the destruction behind us. "Those trees were an eyesore. Your property value just increased substantially. The HOA will be sending you the bill for the removal service, of course." I stared at her, momentarily speechless with rage. "You will regret this," I finally managed. "I promise you that." Corinne's smile never faltered. "Empty threats will only make things worse for you. Welcome to Maple Ridge." She turned and walked away, leaving me standing amid the ruins of my sanctuary. That night, I sat on my back porch looking at the empty sky where my tree canopy had once been. The stumps stood like tombstones in the moonlight. Stars that had been previously filtered through leaves now shone with harsh clarity. I felt exposed, violated, and consumed by a grief so profound it physically hurt. But grief, I discovered, is excellent fuel for action. I stayed up all night, researching everything I could find about my property. I dug through the original deed, property surveys, county records, and historical land use documents. I looked into local environmental regulations, tree protection ordinances, and HOA legal limitations. At 3:27 a.m., I found it. A document filed with the County Environmental Office 20 years earlier. A conservation easement registered when the neighborhood was first developed. It designated the old-growth trees on several properties, including mine, as protected under federal environmental law due to their age, species significance, and role in preventing soil erosion along the nearby creek basin. These were not just any trees. They were federally protected, and Corinne Halstead had just orchestrated their illegal destruction. Dawn broke over a changed landscape, but also over a changed me. This was no longer about neighborhood politics or petty rules. This was about justice, and I was going to make sure Corinne faced every consequence of her actions. The morning after the destruction, I called in sick to work. Sleep deprivation and emotional exhaustion had left me hollow-eyed, but adrenaline kept me moving. With trembling hands, I compiled every scrap of evidence into a comprehensive file: photographs of the trees before and after, security footage, HOA correspondence, the work order with Corinne's signature, and most importantly, the conservation easement documents. By 9 o'clock, I was sitting in the office of Maxwell Jenkins, an environmental attorney whose name I had found through frantic online research. He reviewed my documents in silence, his expression growing increasingly grave as he flipped through the pages. "These were protected trees," he confirmed, tapping the conservation easement. "This document establishes that the old-growth trees on your property were part of a federally recognized conservation zone established during the original development of Maple Ridge. "So what she did was illegal?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Maxwell removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Not just illegal, potentially criminal. Destruction of protected trees violates several environmental statutes and could trigger significant penalties. No HOA covenant can override federal environmental law." For the first time since watching my trees fall, I felt a flicker of hope. What do we do now? "First, we file a formal complaint with the Department of Environmental Protection," Maxwell explained. "Then, we prepare for legal action against both the HOA and Karen Halstead personally. This was not an institutional decision, but a personal vendetta executed under the guise of HOA authority." Over the next 2 weeks, Maxwell and I built our case methodically. We collected affidavits from neighbors who confirmed they never complained about my trees. We obtained satellite imagery showing the tree canopy before destruction. We even tracked down the original landscape architect who had designated the conservation areas 20 years earlier. Meanwhile, the HOA machine shifted into damage control. A certified letter arrived demanding payment of $3,200 for the emergency tree removal services rendered. Another notice informed me that I would be responsible for landscaping restoration to HOA standards within 30 days. Most disturbing was an email from the HOA secretary claiming I had given verbal consent for the tree removal during a phone conversation. It was a blatant lie, but it confirmed my suspicion. They were scrambling to cover their tracks. I forwarded everything to Maxwell, who added each new communication to our growing case file. "They are digging themselves deeper," he observed. "Keep documenting everything." The monthly HOA meeting fell 3 weeks after the incident. Though I was not on the agenda, I attended with a prepared statement. The small community room was unusually crowded. Word had spread about the tree removal controversy. When the floor opened for community concerns, I rose to speak. Before I could begin, Karen interrupted. "If this is about your landscaping situation, we have already addressed this matter privately and through proper channels. This is about the illegal destruction of federally protected trees on my property," I replied, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "Trees that were covered by a conservation easement registered with the county 20 years ago." A murmur spread through the room. Several board members exchanged concerned glances. Karen's laugh cut through the whispers like a knife. "Conservation easement? That is absurd. Those trees were a neighborhood eyesore and a safety hazard. The board acted within its authority." "The board did not act," I corrected her. "You did, Karen. You signed the work order personally without board approval. You trespassed on my property to mark the trees, and you violated federal environmental law in the process." "This is slander," Karen snapped, her composure cracking. "How dare you make these accusations in a public forum?" I held up the manila folder containing our evidence. "Everything I have said is documented. My attorney has already filed complaints with the Department of Environmental Protection, the County Commissioner's Office, and the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division." The room fell silent. For the first time since I had met her, Karen Halstead looked genuinely frightened. "I think we should adjourn this meeting," one board member suggested nervously, "until we have legal counsel present." As people filed out, whispering among themselves, several neighbors approached me. "Those trees were magnificent," one elderly woman said. "I never understood why Karen was so obsessed with removing them." She sent landscapers to trim my hedges last year without permission, another homeowner confided. I was too afraid of retaliation to fight back. I realized then that I was not just fighting for my trees. I was fighting for everyone who had been bullied into silence. The next morning, a process server delivered legal papers to Corinne's home, a cease and desist order and notice of impending litigation for environmental violations, property damage, trespassing, and fraud. The neighborhood rumor mill exploded. People drove slowly past my house, surveying the stumps that stood as evidence of Corinne's overreach. Local environmental groups caught wind of the story and offered support. That night, I stood in my backyard looking at the empty space where my trees had once stood. Their absence still felt like physical pain, but now it was accompanied by something else: determination. Corinne had taken my trees, but in doing so, she had given me something unexpected: a cause worth fighting for, and the courage to see it through to the end. The headline in the local paper read, "HOA President Sued Over Protected Tree Removal." The article detailed our allegations against Corinne Halstead and the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association. What had begun as a neighborhood dispute had evolved into a case that captured public attention. Environmental groups cited it as an example of development overreach. Property rights advocates used it to highlight HOA abuse of power. Corinne's response came through an expensive attorney from a prestigious downtown firm. Their strategy was immediate and transparent: distance Corinne from responsibility and diffuse blame across multiple parties. My client was acting in good faith as an agent of the Homeowners Association, her lawyer argued in preliminary motions. The landscaping company failed to verify proper authorization before removing the trees. Furthermore, the conservation easement was never properly disclosed to the current HOA board. The judge assigned to our case, Honorable Marilyn Watkins, was not easily swayed by legal maneuvering. "This court is concerned with three primary questions," she stated during our first hearing. Were these trees protected under law? Who authorized their removal? And was that authorization legitimate under the HOA's own governance structure? Corinne sat ramrod straight at the defendant's table, her expression carefully neutral. Gone was the neighborhood tyrant who had strutted through Maple Ridge like a dictator. In her place sat a demure woman in a conservative suit who appeared bewildered by the proceedings against her. Our evidence was methodically presented. Maxwell established the legal protection status of the trees through county records and expert testimony. He demonstrated Corinne's personal involvement through the work order bearing her signature, security footage showing her on my property before the removal, and testimony from the landscaping crew confirming she had been present during the cutting. Most damaging was evidence that Corinne had acted without proper board authorization. The HOA bylaws required a full board vote for any enforcement action exceeding $500. The tree removal had cost over $3,000, yet board minutes contained no record of such a vote. Corinne took the stand on the third day. Under her attorney's careful questioning, she portrayed herself as a dedicated volunteer who had only wanted to maintain neighborhood standards. "I believed I was acting within my authority as HOA president," she testified. "The trees presented a safety hazard that required immediate action." During cross-examination, Maxwell was respectfully relentless. "Ms. Halstead, did you consult an arborist to confirm these trees were hazardous?" "No, but it was obvious they were overgrown," Corinne replied. "Did you seek board approval before spending over $3,000 of HOA funds?" "There was an emergency provision in the bylaws." "Please answer the question, Ms. Halstead, yes or no." No, but did you enter the plaintiff's property without permission to mark trees for removal? Karen hesitated. I was conducting an inspection. Did the HOA bylaws authorize you to enter private property and mark items for removal without the owner's consent? Not specifically, no. With each question, Karen's confident facade crumbled further. When Maxwell presented the conservation easement documents, she claimed ignorance. When confronted with her contradictory statements about neighbor complaints, she became defensive. When asked about fabricating claims of verbal consent, she invoked her right against self-incrimination. The turning point came when Judge Watkins addressed Karen directly. Ms. Halstead, this court is troubled by evidence suggesting you knowingly exceeded your authority. Ignorance of the law is not a defense, particularly for someone in a position of community leadership. Karen's attorney requested a brief recess. When court resumed, they proposed a settlement. Outside the courtroom, other members of the HOA board distanced themselves from Karen. We had no knowledge of her actions, the vice president insisted to reporters. The board never authorized the removal of protected trees. By the final day of proceedings, the courtroom was packed. Former Maple Ridge residents showed up with stories of similar encounters with Karen. Environmental activists filled the back rows. Local news had a sketch artist capturing the scene. Judge Watkins rendered her verdict with unmistakable clarity. This court finds the defendant, Karen Halstead, personally liable for the unauthorized removal of federally protected trees. The evidence demonstrates a clear pattern of overreach and abuse of authority. The judgment included restitution for the tree value, assessed at $89,000 by our expert arborist, additional damages for privacy loss and property devaluation, and legal costs. The court also ordered a referral to federal environmental authorities regarding potential criminal penalties for violating the conservation easement. As the gavel fell, I felt a complex wave of emotions. This was not just about money. No amount could truly replace what had been lost, but something fundamental had shifted in the power dynamic of our community. Karen's reign of intimidation had ended in public disgrace. Outside the courthouse, reporters sought statements from both sides. Karen hurried to a waiting car without comment, her face hidden behind large sunglasses despite the cloudy day. I spoke briefly, focusing not on victory but on protection. This case was never about personal vindication, I told the cluster of microphones. It was about establishing that no one, not even an HOA president, has the right to destroy protected environmental resources. Today's ruling sends that message clearly. As cameras flashed and questions continued, I noticed several Maple Ridge residents watching from a distance. Their expressions held something I had not seen before in this community: hope. Karen Halstead's resignation letter arrived by email to all Maple Ridge residents at 11:42 p.m. the night after the court ruling. The message was brief, citing personal reasons and health concerns, with no mention of the lawsuit or judgment against her. By morning, her HOA president parking space stood empty, the personalized sign already removed. The power vacuum created by Karen's departure triggered an emergency board meeting. Attendance was unprecedented. Residents who had never participated in HOA matters filled every seat, with others standing along the walls. The atmosphere crackled with possibility. In light of recent events, the vice president began nervously, we need to appoint an interim president until regular elections in 6 months. A voice called from the back of the room. Why wait? Let us hold a special election now. The bylaws allow it with 2/3 membership approval. Heads turned in my direction as Tom from next door stood. I nominate my neighbor, the one who stood up to protect our community when no one else would. The nomination caught me completely off guard. My plan had been justice, not leadership. But looking around the room at the expectant faces, I realized something important had changed. This was no longer just about my trees. It was about reclaiming our neighborhood. I accept the nomination, I heard myself say. If elected, I would focus on transparency, fairness, and environmental stewardship. Within days, yard signs appeared throughout Maple Ridge. New leadership for a greener community, they proclaimed. The special election ballot had only 2 names, mine, and a longtime board member who had consistently supported Corinne's agenda. The vote was not even close. I won with 83% support, the highest margin in Maple Ridge history. My first official act was to establish an ethics and transparency committee composed of residents from each street in the neighborhood. The HOA exists to enhance our community, not control it, I announced at my first meeting as president. From now on, all enforcement actions will be documented, all finances transparent, and all meetings open to every resident. The transformation began immediately. We rewrote the outdated HOA guidelines, removing arbitrary aesthetic restrictions while strengthening protections for green spaces. We created a community online portal where all HOA documents, budgets, and decisions were accessible to every homeowner. Most satisfying was the comprehensive property review we conducted. Using the exact rules Corinne had enforced so zealously, we identified multiple violations at her immaculately maintained home: unapproved window treatments, non-regulation garden edging, and an unauthorized bird bath. I personally signed each violation notice, careful to use the same formal language Corinne had employed in her campaigns against others. The notices were delivered by certified mail, just as she had always done. While this might have seemed petty to outsiders, the residents of Maple Ridge understood the poetic justice. This was not about revenge but accountability, holding everyone, even the former president, to the same standards. Corinne received no special treatment, no extended deadlines. She complied with each citation without comment, her gardener and handyman making the required changes with mechanical efficiency. Meanwhile, I channeled my court settlement into something constructive. Working with local conservation officials, I obtained permits to plant new native trees throughout the neighborhood, not just on my property, but in common areas and willing neighbors' yards. The Maple Ridge Restoration Project became a community event. Families arrived with shovels and gardening gloves. Children learned about native species. Even local media covered our efforts, portraying Maple Ridge as a model for neighborhood environmental stewardship. "This is how you rebuild after loss," I explained to a reporter as we planted a red maple sapling in the community park. Not by dwelling on what was destroyed, but by creating something new and better. The saplings were small mere twigs compared to the majestic oaks Corinne had cut down, but they represented something powerful: resilience. Each new tree was tagged with a small plaque explaining its species, expected growth pattern, and environmental benefits. As our restoration efforts gained attention, unexpected allies emerged. The county environmental department offered grants for additional plantings. A local university's ecology department proposed using Maple Ridge as a case study in suburban conservation. 6 months into my term, Maple Ridge had transformed. Property values increased not through sterile conformity, but through enhanced green spaces and community engagement. The HOA, once feared as a punishment mechanism, became a vehicle for neighborhood improvement. Karen watched it all from the sidelines, her influence diminished to nothing. She no longer attended meetings. She declined invitations to community events. Her curtains remained drawn when volunteer groups gathered on her street. And then quietly, a for sale sign appeared in front of her house. The seasons turned, marking the passage of time in ways only nature can truly measure. 1 year after the chainsaws silenced my sanctuary, I stood in my backyard at dawn, coffee steam rising in the cool morning air. Where massive stumps had once testified to destruction, young trees now stretched toward the sky, red maples, river birches, and oak saplings carefully selected for their ecological value. They were small, of course. Nature cannot be rushed. The saplings stood barely 10 feet tall, their trunks still slender enough to wrap my hands around. The shade they cast was modest, their presence more promise than fulfillment. But they were alive and growing stronger with each passing day. Karen Halstead's house had sold quickly, despite the premium price she demanded. The new owners, a young family with 2 children, knew nothing of the neighborhood's recent history. They joined our community gardening days with enthusiasm, their daughter helping to name the butterfly garden we installed in the common area. The Great Tree Incident, as neighbors now called it, had faded from daily conversation, but its impact remained in concrete ways. The completely rewritten HOA guidelines now included an entire section on environmental protection. The board structure had been reformed to prevent any single person from wielding unchecked authority. The community calendar was filled with collaborative projects rather than compliance inspections. I had not sought re-election as HOA president when my term ended. My goal had never been power, only justice and restoration. Besides, the systems we put in place no longer required a champion to function properly. The transparency processes, community voting requirements, and environmental focus continued without my direct involvement. The final chapter of my tree saga arrived unexpectedly in the form of an official letter from the State Environmental Protection Agency. They had reviewed our restoration work and selected Maple Ridge as the recipient of their annual Conservation Leadership Award. The accompanying grant would fund additional native plantings throughout the neighborhood. The award ceremony was held on a perfect spring day in the community park we had revitalized. As I accepted the glass plaque on behalf of Maple Ridge, I scanned the gathered faces. Some were neighbors who had stood with me from the beginning. Others had initially supported Karen, but later embraced our community-first approach. All of them now understood what had truly been at stake. When my trees were cut down, I began my brief acceptance speech. I thought what I wanted was revenge. I wanted the person responsible to suffer as I had suffered. But what I discovered through this journey was something far more powerful than retribution. A gentle breeze rustled through the young trees surrounding the gathering. True justice is not found in punishment, but in restoration. Not in tearing down, but in building up. The trees we lost can never be replaced, but what grew in their absence, community, accountability, and stewardship, has taken deeper root than any oak ever could. Later that evening, as twilight settled over Maple Ridge, I walked the winding paths of our neighborhood alone. Children's bicycles lay abandoned in driveways as families gathered for dinner. Porch lights winked on one by one. In front yards and common areas, the silhouettes of young trees stood like sentinels against the darkening sky. I paused at the spot where Karen's house had once displayed her pretentious Halstead residence sign. The new family had replaced it with a simple wooden plaque reading, "The Baxter Family Est 2022, surrounded by freshly planted flowers." Revenge, I had learned, comes in many forms. Sometimes the most complete revenge is simply to create something better than what was destroyed. Karen had sought control through fear and rigid conformity. What replaced her legacy was a community built on mutual respect and shared values. As the first stars appeared overhead, I made my way back to my own yard. The young oak nearest my patio had sprouted new leaves that week, its slender branches reaching skyward with unmistakable vitality. I placed my hand against its smooth bark, feeling the subtle flow of life beneath my fingers. These trees would outlive the memory of Karen Halstead. They would grow tall and strong, providing shade for generations to come. And in their spreading canopies would be the most perfect revenge of all, the quiet triumph of returning to the natural order of things, where growth and community flourish not through control, but through care. In the morning, I would wake to birdsong and those young branches, nature's persistent reminder that life continues. But for now, I stood in the growing darkness, surrounded by new beginnings that had emerged from endings I never wanted. Some say revenge is best served cold. I